wrong side of the law, in jail, or even get you killed. A time also remembered for a mysterious murder in Mississippi that changed the course of American history. A murder dramatized in the movie Mississippi Burning. But the mystery remains. How law enforcement and even the Ku Klux Klan always seemed to know so much about the civil rights workers they were determined to stop. Were you spying?
Well, I was gathering intelligence.
Meet Earl Johnston, spy master.
Had you ever been trained in the ways of surveillance or espionage?
I never went to college. Never took a course of any kind like that.
Though he downplays his espionage credentials today, from 1963 to 1968, Johnston headed the Sovereignty Commission, a state agency created to preserve Mississippi's segregated way of life.
Drinking fountains are segregated. Restrooms are segregated.
It started with propaganda films like this one that tried to sanitize the racial oppression with preposterous claims.
Both races retain their identities and achieve their own destinies without either race forcing itself upon the other.
But behind this locked door, and sealed for 50 years by order of the state legislature, is the untold story of the Commission's clandestine operations.
They were using taxpayers' money to legalize lynching, murdering, bombing, killing and beating of black people and white people who were attempting to help black people gain the right to vote.
Hollis Watkins was targeted by Sovereignty Commission spies not only for helping register black voters, but for recruiting new workers for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an organization despised by segregationists.
I was put in jail. I've been chased, had guns pointed in my face. I thought things were just happening haphazardly. But later on, it came very clear to me that there was a systematic process and a network set up in the state where people were gathering information on us that was working in the movement.
I think the word network is really exaggeration. Network sounds like you've got 100 people out there doing that, but we didn't have that many.
Johnston claims he had only 3 full-time investigators, but they weren't doing the spying. That was handled through private detective agencies, like Day Detectives in Jackson, a security firm that still does a lot of business with the state and refused to talk to Dateline. They recruited the informants, paid them in cash, and then submitted vouchers to the commission with no names, so there'd be no record of who the spies were or where all those tax dollars were going.
What kind of information were they looking for? Names of organization members?
Sometimes there were names that were used.
What constituted a good report?
A good report would be one that would warn us about a plan being made to take over someplace or demonstrate a march and cause problems. That would be a good report.
The other side says you were collecting that information, passing it on to local law enforcement in an ongoing effort to see to it that there was intimidation.
Well, where you got that, I don't know, but I never did take that attitude at all. We wanted to prevent that kind of stuff.
Where we got it was from this former Sovereignty Commission spy.
You know, I lost my stomach for it.
Charlie Neal began spying the year Johnston left the commission. He was a junior here at the University of Mississippi.
Did you turn over names?
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I did.
How much were they paying you?
The money was nice.
A couple $100 a week?
Yeah, it might have been that much, which was a lot then.
On one occasion, Neal remembers being paid to help run one student activist out of the state by setting him up for a drug sting.
He was arrested and was charged, and
You never saw him again?
Never saw him again.
Did he do anything to deserve
it? He didn't do a thing. You know, the people they were targeting were just not bad people.
But that didn't seem to matter. If you set foot in Mississippi and didn't support the status quo, Earl Johnston had a name for you.
You referred to them as invaders.
Yeah, I said invaders because they came in from outside the state, and anything that comes in from outside the state is invading the state.
And those so-called invaders were often greeted with the violence that was everywhere in Mississippi during the civil rights struggle. Though the commission may not have engaged in it, people like Hollis Watkins say it more than encouraged it by seeing to it that names, photographs, and even license plate numbers somehow got into the wrong hands.
I so happened to pass a white man in a pickup truck, and he saw the license plate number. The red light went on, and he said, "This is the one that I'm supposed to at least intimidate." Then that man began to pursue me and pull out a pistol as if he was going to shoot me.
It wasn't enough that you were a black man who had passed him on the road?
No, it was not enough. Black people pass white people all the time, driving up and down the highways.
And it wasn't limited to those rural back roads. The commission's influence reached all the way to this courtroom in the state capitol. March 1964. Byron Della Beckwith was facing murder charges for the assassination of Medgar Evers, the renowned civil rights leader, shot down here in the driveway of his own home. The state promised to bring the killer to justice. But while the state of Mississippi was prosecuting the Evers case, it was also trying to undermine it by secretly helping the defense. It turns out that just before the second trial, the Sovereignty Commission did some investigating of the prospective jurors, calling them and collecting information on each and every one, and then turning the information over not to state prosecutors, but incredibly to the defense lawyers, so they would know who they could count on just in time for jury selection.
Everybody the commission recommended made the jury. Everybody the commission criticized didn't.
Reporter Jerry Mitchell of the Jackson Clarion Ledger was leaked a copy of the secret report detailing what the commission had done, and he shared it with Dateline.
For instance, one man said they, quote, knew his thinking and did not recommend him for jury duty. Another man, it says, believed to be Jewish, no further information available. And those people, of course, never made the jury.
And I plead guilty to made a mistake.
Not jury tampering, but pretty clearly over the line.
I have agreed that it was improper and everything. It was not. We should not have done it.
But they did, and never answered for it. And Byron Della Beckwith, whose fingerprints were on the murder weapon, went unpunished for 29 years until that secret report about the commission and the jurors finally came out in the newspaper.
Ironically, that is what led to the reopening of the case.
He wound up being re-indicted and ultimately convicted.
And had it not been for that report, he might be a free man still.
Which only makes you wonder what other secrets about the Sovereignty Commission are still locked away in those files. Well, Dateline has seen some of those files and uncovered information you've never heard about one of the most pivotal events of the civil rights era, the story of a famous triple murder, the killing of civil rights workers Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and the Commission's most successful spy, an insider known in the files as Agent X.
Agent X was a trusted member of the movement.
How much damage was he in a position to do?
Agent X could give a positive description of 80 to 90% of the active people that was working in the movement in Mississippi.
It was spring 1964 when Agent X first came through with the kind of information the Commission shared with law enforcement across the state, so they would all know who the targets were. Most notably, this license tag number, H25503. Remember that number, you'll hear more about it later. It belonged to the car driven by a man who epitomized everything the Commission scorned, a young, liberal, Jewish civil rights worker from New York, poking around in Mississippi's business.
Investigation of above-captioned subject reveals that his name is Michael Henry Schwerner. Gives his date of birth, his hair color, his eye color, his address in Mississippi, even the fact that his wife recently purchased a Singer sewing machine. What did you need all this information for?
We did. He was so visible, he didn't even care who knew what he was doing. He was just inviting antagonism to him.
Antagonism and constant attention. In June 1964, Schwerner and James Cheney, a young black activist from Mississippi, joined thousands of civil rights workers and student volunteers at this conference in Oxford, Ohio. They were preparing for Freedom Summer, the landmark voter registration drive that year. What they didn't know was that Agent X had followed them there.
Report from Agent X from Oxford, Ohio, June 1964. Students were trained during the day on how to protect themselves in the event that they were attacked.
So?
The first load of students leaving for Mississippi will leave on June 21st. They'll be traveling by bus and by automobile. They will arrive in Jackson on or about June 22nd. He gave you information on when the students were coming, how they were coming, how many were coming.
And that was what we wanted to know. We wanted to know when they were coming in.
And thanks to Agent X, they did. But the spy's information didn't stop there. As usual, the commission passed it on to law enforcement, and that opened up dangerous possibilities.
Law enforcement was so infiltrated by the Klan.
So if you're sharing this information with law enforcement,
That's right.
ultimately you're sharing it with
With the Klan.
On the night of June 21st, shortly after Schwerner, Cheney, and this volunteer from New York, Andrew Goodman, returned from Ohio, the three were pulled off the highway outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, and murdered by Klansmen. And hardly noticed on their burned-out car at the time was the tag number, H25503, the same number identified in that first report from Agent X.
Agent X knew the consequences that could come about as a result of passing on the information. And I think the passing of the license plate number gave them positive identification where that they could pass it on to whoever was supposed to pull the trigger.
7 Klansmen were later arrested and charged with violating the victim's civil rights. 2 of them wore badges that night on the highway. They were members of local law enforcement.
Do you feel at all responsible?
No.
Yourself or the commission for the violence that was visited?
Local people on various occasions did resort to some violence, but it wasn't anything we had anything to do with it.
I think Earl Johnson has gotten to the point where he realized how devastating and how evil this act was, and he can't admit the truth that he was a part of it.
I would call him a lie as far as I'm concerned.
Who was this Agent X?
I'm not going to tell you that.
When we come back, after 3 decades, the mystery ends. Agent X unmasked.
We're talking about someone who falls in the category of being classified as a traitor.
Can you prove it?
And wait till you see who he is and what he's doing now. Returning now to our investigation, who was this mystery man, Agent X, so valuable to the white segregationists in Mississippi? The man he was spying for, Earl Johnston, wouldn't reveal his identity, but Dateline tracked him down. In the extraordinary spy operation run out of Mississippi's capital, one agent stood alone.
Agent X was in a position to do all kind of dangerous things to the movement.
Worth every bit of the $500 a month they were paying him.
He definitely was worth that. It's amazing that he sold himself so cheap.
Who is Agent X?
My 100% belief, R.L. Bolden is Agent X.
Our main objective and priorities are, in order:
Could this be Agent X?
1, adequate income opportunities for minorities.
His name is R.L. Bolden, and looking at his credentials, the last man you'd suspect of being a spy. Once a respected member of the NAACP, trusted political advisor to candidates both black and white, successful businessman, and at the time of this speech in 1976, the highest black appointed official in Mississippi.
We're talking about someone who's a traitor.
Can you prove it?
When we began ourselves to look back at some of the records of various meetings where R.L. attended those meetings, it just so happens that his name is the only name that don't appear in the report.
Reports like this one, where Agent X described for the commission what he heard and who he saw at black voter registration meetings. But strangely, he never mentioned one key person who was always there, R.L. Bolden.
If I'm writing a report for someone, telling them all about who's at the meetings and what goes on at these meetings, I don't have to put my name in there because I'm the one giving the report. It's enough to convince me.
But even more convincing is what Dateline found here in one of Agent X's own reports. The names of people who could confirm beyond a doubt who the mystery agent was. The report detailed that trip we told you about to and from Oxford, Ohio in 1964, where civil rights workers, including Agent X, gathered to prepare for the Summer March on Mississippi.
Be prepared to go to jail, and you should be prepared to stay there for a while.
Agent X wrote, "I left Oxford at 6:30 p.m. on Friday, June 26th. Lois Schaefer, Pete Stoner, and Jimmy Wilcox were with me." Dateline couldn't find Schaefer or Wilcox, but we did find Agent X's other passenger.
We rode up there and stayed about a week and came back.
Pete Stoner was a foot soldier in the struggle for civil rights. He still lives in Jackson and never forgot that trip to Ohio. And who was at the wheel?
R.L. Bolin drove both ways.
He drove you there, and
Yes.
he drove you back.
Yes, it's his Cadillac.
You're absolutely sure it was him?
Yes, I'm 100% sure of that. Then on the way back, as soon as we got into Mississippi, we were followed by the highway patrol all the way back to almost to Jackson.
Stoner's memory is accurate. They were followed. But what he didn't know is that the troopers weren't harassing them. They were following orders. Earl Johnston's orders. Memorandum, June 26, 1964. We would appreciate cooperation of the Highway Patrol in assuring safe passage of one of our informants. Subject is a colored male who will be driving a 1957 Cadillac. This is signed by you, Earl Johnston.
Yeah,
Do you remember writing this?
Yeah, I remember writing that. Didn't want anything to happen to anybody.
Especially not to one of your informants.
Well, maybe so.
And it was effective. Indeed,
Well,
Agent X got his escort,
yeah,
and you were successful in not blowing his cover.
that's right. I guess. I never heard anything more about it.
But most persuasive of all is something else we heard about R.L. Bolden from a man who helped organize the Ohio Conference.
We met in the training session in the auditorium. In that meeting was Bolden, Schwerner, Cheney, Goodman, Peter Stoner.
Lawrence Guillot remembers a meeting in which Bolden went to great lengths to help convince 3 civil rights workers it was safe to return to Mississippi. The same 3 who would later be pulled from their car and murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi.
R.L. Bolden showed an overt interest in them. He participated in the discussion to get them to return.
But according to Guillot, there was something else Bolden was keenly interested in.
He requested the tag numbers of the cars so that, quote, he could assist in seeing that protection was provided for them.
While there's no evidence Bolden did anything more than pass on information, looking back on it now, Guillot believes he was setting them up.
I can't see how he could possibly be uninvolved.
As for Earl Johnston, the former spymaster still refuses to discuss Agent X's identity publicly, saying only that Agent X was a file name for several informants and that he didn't know any of them. But Dateline learned of a statement Johnston made privately under oath during a court deposition where he was asked who Agent X was. And your answer was, not sure how to spell it, but the name was Bolden.
Yeah, I remember that.
Do you believe Agent X was R.L. Bolden?
I'll put it this way. He could have been, but I don't know for certain.
What would you say today to Agent X, whoever he is?
I would have nothing to say to him.
Were you grateful for his efforts?
On certain occasions, we were grateful.
And did that gratitude bring rewards? Well, it's impossible to say for sure. But look at what's happened to R.L. Bolden over the years. In the late 1960s, he ran an office and school supply company out of this building in Jackson and landed lucrative state contracts. In 1976, Governor Cliff Finch appointed him head of minority affairs, a post Bolden held for 4 years. In 1982, federal prosecutors accused Bolden of misusing federal funds and accepting kickbacks while in office. He pled guilty to conspiracy to defraud the federal government. But even though Bolden served time in prison, he still didn't fall out of favor with white political leaders in Mississippi. In fact, to find him today, all you have to do is open a book. This book, the Staff Directory for the United States Congress. He's listed on page 614 as a staff assistant to Congressman Mike Parker of Mississippi. Dateline requested an interview with Bolden's boss, but Congressman Parker refused. And we asked repeatedly for an interview with R.L. Bolden himself. He declined. But the night after Parker's re-election last November, we caught up with Bolden.
Mr. Bolden?
He'd been working late in the congressman's Jackson office.
I'm Stone Phillips with NBC News. Can I ask you a couple of questions, just for a moment? Were you a paid informant for the Sovereignty Commission? Have you ever confronted R.L. Bolden?
No, I haven't confronted R.L. about this. It wouldn't be a situation where that I could contain myself, and I would probably do something that I might regret for the rest of my life.
It's that serious, how you feel about it.
Right. But I would never understand why he did what he did, and I would never forget it.
As we said, the files on the Sovereignty Commission were sealed for 50 years, until 2027. But it looks like a federal court will have them opened in the next 2 years, when we'll get the full story on Agent X.
Coming up, he lived for his wife, his family, his job. Then he was trapped